Hello, welcome to video number 21, the second in the mollusk series. And we're starting with going into the individual classes. The first one, polyplacophora. So we've seen poly before, many, and then placophora, that's plate, so bearer of many plates. And these are something you probably have seen. You might not have understood what they were. They look a bit like a limpet, um, or maybe a pawa, but with these different shells. Okay, like here's one plate, and here's another plate. So they're like a pawa, but with lots of shells, or another a limpet with a lot of shells. And these are called chitons. So they're very common, especially in the shallow water. They tend to be grazers of algae and small things that have settled on the rocks, scrape things away with their radula, and they always have 8 valves or plates. Okay. The margins of the plates are covered by the mantle. So the mantle is this has gotten thickened, but it is still that blanket of tissue that covers the visceral mass and the muscular foot. And in the chitons, often it's sometimes known as a girdle, but the girdle is kind of has a scaly appearance, and that's why it's got names like snake skin chitin. But you can diagnose what species it is often by looking at the girdle. And here's what they look like underneath. So you'll see the muscular foot, which is used for sticking to rocks, sticking to the substrate, moving. And on top of that, sitting on top of it is the visceral mass, which has all of the organs, and then the mantle, girdle is sometimes called, it sits over the very top of it, and the plates on top of that. So this thing can just suction onto the rocks, and it's like a little shell. It's also very streamlined. They're usually very streamlined, so they can put up with some pretty high wave tolerance without getting knocked off in some pretty rough environments. You'll find these in intertidal areas in quite rough environments. Let's go to blue here. And so if the water current is induced by muscular contractions that comes in at the front, out at the back, you'll see these very simple gills, which look a bit like feathers. They're called bipectinate. Okay, so there's a gill. It looks a bit like a feather. Bipectinate meaning two sides, and we'll talk about that a bit more when we examine the evolution of mollusks. All right, so if we go with the gonopore, the nephridiopore, and the anus, so that means that eggs, wees, and poos all respectively come out and are carried away by the water current out the back. So these things just go along scraping algae and other types of things off of rocks that have settled, and they're kind of omnivores, but mostly eat algae. And they will essentially, because they mostly eat algae, are generally found in the photic zone. So up in the top 20, 30, 40 meters of water before, well, where algae grows more prolifically. All right, moving on from the chitons, we're going to move to the next class, gastropods. And gastropods are the most diverse of all the mollusk classes. So most of the mollusks that you're going to see are going to be gastropods. Typical snails, nudibranchs, and all the land snails will all be gastropods. So gastro, we've encountered that root before, meaning stomach. Poda, okay, so you see the same root for foot, so stomach, foot, and that's because these things essentially crawl along on their stomach, but they actually more like a more accurate way to say it would be they crawl along on their muscular foot, but they have their body above the muscular foot being carried along and often a shell. All right, you will not be responsible for prosobranch or opistobranchia. Okay, but you should know the subclass Pulmonata. So make a flashcard with that one, Pulmonata. Uh, pulmonary means air. Okay, so pulmonary, air breathing. And so these are all land snails, are Pulmonata. And the one snail that you are responsible for in your shell collection, Amphibola crenata, the mud snail, that's the exception to the marine snail rule in that it feeds when the tide is out and just hunkers down when the tide is in so it doesn't drown by keeping a little bit of air, a little air bubble within its shell, which it uses for gas exchange. Whereas all the other ones have gills, and they just keep their gills wet while the tide is out, and then actively feed when the tide is in. Okay, or they stay underwater. All right, so this is something that you need to try to learn is planospiral and asymmetrical. So this is a very important sort of way that has allowed snails to radiate into lots of different environments is by changing the shape of their shell to a strong, more sort of circular shell. That it means that you can have more strength in a smaller area, a smaller volume. Okay, so dorsal shield. This is your very common, either like a kind of thing like a pawa or a limpet or something like that. Or you can see how a bivalve, it looks a bit like a like a cockle. And if you put two sides together, then obviously that would be like a cockle shell. But if you just look at this as like a pawa that has sort of starts to elongate, then you can start to see this planospiral shell where it's all bilaterally symmetrical on a plane. And then in order to increase strength and make this into a little more compact area, you get the asymmetrical shell where the plane turns into more of a spiral where it's still bilaterally symmetrical in a way, but it's on a spiral. It's just off-centered. And then also what happens is the body mass is twisted like we saw in the hermit crabs, and that's called torsion. And this means that everything, the inside shell can become a bit of a structural support for the outside shell, and the shell just keeps growing. The mantle just keeps secreting along the edge here, and of it, and the shell just keeps getting bigger, and there's a bit of secretion along here as well. But the shell just keeps getting bigger and bigger by growing in a circle. All right, so most of the prosoprancs, what are commonly known as snails, okay, they have developed an operculum, which closes the aperture of the shell. The aperture is the opening of the shell. And if we have a look at that, here is a typical shell, and the operculum is another part that is not connected to the rest of the shell. It's still made of calcium carbonate. But it can be pulled in like a trap door, and you'll see these. This is what you'd call the cat's eye on a cat's eye snail, where the little hard bit is pulled in to make the trap door that closes the opening of the shell so no predators can get in and get to the meat or the body of the snail. So when we look at the terminology of the whole shell, there are a few things that I would like you to know. Okay, the apex is the top of it. A whorl is one trip around the shell. So if you start here and you go around and get bigger to this point. One trip around, one rotation around the shell is one whorl. Okay, so the height of the whorl is used as a diagnostic feature, and the spire is all the way from uh, the first whorl, like from where the opening is, go around once, and then you mark where that first whorl is, and then you go up to the very top of the shell, the apex, and that is the height of the spire. So obviously the spire is all of the relic whorls besides the last one. The aperture is the opening, just like the aperture in a camera. There's the outer lip, which is the outside edge here, the inner lip, which is the inside edge, and some snails have this siphonal notch, a siphon, and some do not. Okay, let's chat about that. I noticed that we're coming very close to the past the 10-minute mark, so I'll just make a note of these quick differences, and then we'll talk about it in more detail in the next video. So the prosoprancs can be divided into three different orders: archeo, meaning older; meso, middle; and neo, new. Okay, neo gastropods. We'll talk about the morphological differences, but they follow along in terms of evolutionary pathway. So the snails, the siphons that we were pointing out, are a newer development that allow the snails, to be a little more sensory, and then finally the neogastropods, they have these siphon grooves, which we'll also talk about, but they allowed for mollusks to radiate out into many different habitats. We'll check that out in the next video. Thank you.